Hello, everyone. I'm frequently humbled and touched, motivated and encouraged when people contact me by email or texting or commenting, or they greet me on the street and tell me that my work has been transformative for them. If this has been the case for you, and also if you want to share it with other people, please consider supporting my work by joining my Patreon community. All financial support goes to the Vervaeke Foundation, where my team and I are diligently working to create the science, the practices, the teaching, and the communities. If you want to participate in my work, and many of you ask me that, how can I participate? How can I get involved? Then this is the way to do it. The Vervaeke Foundation is something that I'm creating with other people, and I'm trying to create something as virtuously as I possibly can. No grifting, no setting myself up as a guru. I want to try and make something really work so that people can support, participate, and find community by joining my Patreon. I hope you consider that this is a way in which you can make a difference and matter. Please consider joining my Patreon community at the link below. Thank you so very much for your time and attention. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Voices with Vervaeke. I'm very pleased to be here with Brendan Graham Dempsey. We've had a lot of conversations before, but the one that's most pertinent, and there'll be a link in the notes to this video, is this actually second part of a series. And the first part is on Brendan's channel. And then I said, well, let's hop back and forth between channels as we do this as a way of introducing our work to each other's audience. And so, first of all, welcome, Brendan. It's great to see you here again. I'll let you say a little bit about yourself in a sec, but I'll first just sort of give a bit of a summary about what we talked about last time. I won't take too long because people can go and watch the video. But Brendan was challenging me in the right way, the Socratic way, to articulate what this revisioning, renewing Neoplatonism looks like today. And we talked about the overcoming of some of things like the two worlds mythology and the interaction with and the potential integration with Zen, and how Neoplatonism and Zen could enter into a fellowship of opponent processing that would be mutually beneficial. And this work has already been tried, or at least initiated, by the Kyoto School, and a bunch of other things around that. Brendan has done some really excellent work recently about really wrestling with what we mean when we talk about meaning, making use of my work and other people's work. I gave an excellent presentation at the Consilience Conference. And so that's sort of the background where we're at. And we're going to try and pick up the threads around Neoplatonism, or maybe Zen Neoplatonism, and the emerging cognitive science, etc., around meaning and why that all matters. So welcome, Brendan.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really excited for this. I really enjoyed our last talk, and I got just from what I heard from people, it also sounds like a lot of these things are really live for them too. So I feel like we're really exploring some important things. And yeah, happy to pick up the threads and carry them further and see where it goes.
So why don't you tell everybody a little bit more about yourself, because my audience might not know you that well.
Sure. So, well, you did a great service in coining this phrase, the meaning crisis, and kind of taking that forward. And that's a very helpful frame for me to talk about the stuff that I'm interested in, which is within that context, basically. So I do a lot of work in metamodern spirituality, trying to think about what is spirituality, what is meaning making after postmodernism. What does that look like after you do deconstruction and critique and kind of unpack things to a sufficient level of kind of deconstructive depth? What does it look like to reconstruct? How do we understand meaning and spirituality and religion after all that work gets done? And so a lot of people in this sort of scene, this corner of the internet, are I think particularly rightly fascinated by this topic, and it's very pertinent, very urgent. So that's mainly my stuff. Yeah, I've been writing some books on this topic. I have like a metamodern spirituality series, and the most recent book in that line was this emergentism work that I published, I think earlier this year, actually, which is sort of looking at the broad kind of history of cosmic complexification and trying to sort of situate our sense of reality within the kind of a cosmic evolutionary big time or deep time kind of big history framework, in a broad sense. So also engaging with this issue of the religion's not a religion, some kind of religion beyond two worlds mythologies. So a lot of our work is very consonant for sure. So yeah.
So what's most alive for you right now in your work? What's calling to you the most right now?
Well, I'm working on this book called The Evolution of Meaning at the moment. And you mentioned the Consilience Conference presentation I gave. And it's really, that was sort of the beginning of this project that I'm working on. That presentation and the associated paper was kind of the kind of kernel of the introductory chapter that sort of frames meaning and human meaning making within this broader complexification narrative, linking, what do we mean by this? And has to do with, individuals in transjective relationships with environments, finding information meaningful in terms of viability and the flourishing of entities in their context. So using that as sort of a basis and then trying to see, well, given that information has sort of complexified over the eons through these different emergent levels of information processing, such as the work that Greg Enriquez does really a great job mapping with the UTOC framework from matter to life to mind to culture. If these kind of represent novel information processing systems, and if meaning is in some sense a processing of information for viability, then we can kind of think about the complexification of meaning through time. So then I'm really interested in seeing how human meaning is basically a complex form of this information processing. And how does that look like for, when we're thinking about worldviews and God concepts and notions of the sacred? So it's kind of it's an ambitious, work. It'll probably be, definitely be my longest to date. But that's sort of what I'm really excited about. So I've been doing some really deep dives. And as you mentioned, I'm drawing on your work as well for that in an important way when I consider the mind cognitive level of this process.
Wow, that was really rich. I'm really excited about what you're doing. Greg and I are starting a new series together on the cognitive science playlist on my channel, Transcendent Naturalism. We're hoping, of course, you'll be a guest on there with us at some point. One of the co-creators, co-collaborators of the overarching argument. So I'm wondering about what you just said, and of course, I'm in very deep and broad agreement with it in detail and in Gestalt. So this question is not a challenge question, like in that sense. It's like you get this model of meaning, right? And that's sort of an epistemic aspect, and then you can bring in something that's sort of on the epistemic and the ontological, which is intelligibility. The world makes sense to us, and then you can sort of ask these kinds of questions. You can ask the question, well, cognition seems to be organized, right, this way, levels, bottom, and reality is like we seem to be organized that way, and intelligibility is organized that way, and they all seem to fit together in this really mutually supportive fashion. And then, of course, the move I'm going to play here is, well, that sounds very much like a Neoplatonic framework in which, except you need you would need to place in equal stature emanation with emergence. And my argument for that is emergence without corresponding emanation is just epiphenomenalism, which gives you none of what you want out of your leveled ontology. And so I'm just picking up on what we talked about last time, and you see the connection I'm trying to make. Do you think they're the kind of thing you're arguing for is one that perhaps is deeply resonant with I get it, a revised Neoplatonic framework?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. And in the reason why our conversation and this topic is so fascinating to me is because I find a lot of incredible value in this material in Plotinus, and I've been just fascinated with the whole tradition for a long time and its various extensions in kind of the Western tradition more broadly, whether that's Pseudo-Dionysius or Dante, who kind of poeticizes it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's always just very much struck me. And I think that's part of why I'm so drawn to this view, this sort of cosmological view, because if you read a work like the Divine Comedy, you get this leveled ontology that's very much informed by a Neoplatonic framework, of course, blending with kind of a Christian cosmology and a kind of grand narrative. And it seemed like after modernity showed up and traditionalism was sort of kicked to the wayside, that just wasn't possible. It was sort of like, no, that's not how the world works, and we kind of got this reduced, flattened reductionism. And so I see in, yes, emergent phenomena and complexity, this incredible potential for regaining some of that depth, literally that kind of that layered depth to reality in a way that is very much in accord with our cutting edge science. So that's why the whole topic is so fitting. At the same time, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that they're the same thing. So
No, no, no.
they're getting at something that seems to be real. And now I think we're trying to clarify what is that to the best of our understanding. So I definitely see a lot of overlap there with these traditions. At the same time, there's another component which I think is kind of missing from what I understand the kind of more Platonic or Neoplatonic tradition to be getting at, which is I think that in that tradition there's much more emphasis of conformity. There's a conformity kind of epistemology of like the
Yeah,
mind conforms to reality.
yes.
Whereas what I draw a lot more from is kind of a constructivist Piagetian developmental perspective, which is that is kind of half of the equation, right? So if the conformity idea is sort of one way of looking at epistemology, and then you get like the Kantian, Copernican revolution that's like, no, it's actually the mind imposes on reality. I think if you actually synthesize both of those perspectives, that's probably the closest thing. So it's this, and that's very much that transjective individual operating in relationship to an environment and sort of mutually, making those things intelligible by adapting to, which I guess, Piaget would call accommodation, but also assimilating to, which would be that kind of Kantian thing. So I think that's an important element to bring into this mixture that isn't necessarily as pronounced in the Platonic or Neoplatonic tradition, but should be foregrounded, because it's sort of a mutual creation of reality, but creation of reality in the context of describing a real ontological world that exists. And so I think you can kind of get both of those going on.
I think that's excellent. I mean, yeah, I tend to draw models as 4E cog sci does from biology, and I think about there's something sort of equivalent to there's instead of biological, there's epistemic niche construction going on. We're shaping the environment as it shapes us, and then we shape the environment, and so there's that loop. I very much think that's the case. Now, interestingly, if you look at some more recent Christian Platonists, I even think Neoplatonists, and Catherine Pickstock's astonishing book, Aspects of Truth. She has a whole chapter about what she calls the poetic argument for God. And she tries to lay out this idea that it's conformity, but it's, I think, a poetic, where we read really broad in what we mean by poiesis. But it's poetic conformity in that you're not only conforming, you're serving to draw out what, right? There's a sense of completing, not finishing, but completing, drawing out, adding on to what she called she said it's something like identity without repetition. Like it's like you draw out what the thing is. And it's almost like the correspondence to Platonic anamnesis. Well, I'm learning, but I've always known this, right? And it's like, oh, this is a sort of a new aspect of the thing that was drawn out by human beings, but nevertheless, it somehow was always part of what that thing is, and that's what makes it good art. And that made me think of Scari's work about when we see something beautiful, it has that double call to us, right? like she gives the example of the beautiful tree, and it reminds us of all the trees we've seen before, but it also says, I didn't realize trees could be like this, right? And and Pickstock is saying, well, there's a lot more poetry on our knowing than we are properly given credit for. And so so there's and I take her to be a really important figure in sort of modern Christian, Platonic Christian Neoplatonic ontology. Her book is an ontological book, Aspects of Truth Towards a Religious Metaphysics. And so I'm in complete agreement with you. And I mean, and Goethe has similar things going on when he's trying to see the phenomena and the earth, right? The plants and all that. And Bartov talks about this. Yeah, there's something about that there's a way in which we are drawn into conformity, but we also draw something out of the thing in our conforming to it. And so the model, which is a Platonic model of like of the love relationship, where you're conforming to the other, but you also are they're also being drawn out by that relationship. I think that's exactly right, and I do think that is something that I think it is being developed and needs to be talked about much more, about this attempt to bring back the Neoplatonic framework. But I think Pickstock is doing an excellent job in Aspects of Truth.
Yeah, I mean, it's gosh, it's such a rich and important topic, and I also cognize too that sort of my understanding of Neoplatonism could probably it might be more informed by some kind of flatter interpretations and.
No, I think your point is well said. No, I really do think your point is well said. I think I think it's so well said that people need to be responsive to it and responsible to it, and people are. I think that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah. No, I just think it's one of those things that I'm sure you could probably even read these original materials and draw out from those materials some of the intimations of some of these ideas, and I'm sure some thinkers have done that. And so I'm excited by how the Neoplatonic tradition, even as it kind of enters into contemporary times, is able to do that and foreground some of these things in important ways. But I think it's crucial because one of the dangers, and we talked a little bit about this in our first conversation, is that certain kinds of modes of interpreting the kind of Neoplatonic vision can kind of gravitate, I think, towards this sort of you lose particularity, you lose individuation, and you sort of become abstract in this sort of general, and then you lose all the richness of reality. And so there's, I think, whereas what you're kind of talking about, this sort of participation, which of course is a very Platonic word, but if you want to think about participation in well, it could be the one, I guess you could say, but in this sort of process, it's one that doesn't lose the individuating aspect. It's actually, it sort of comes through the individuating aspect. And so I like kind of blending this sort of Neoplatonic vision with something more like Jungian individuation ideas, right? Where like there's something about deep reality that we connect to that comes through precisely through our particularity and our uniqueness, that we're somehow kind of manifesting almost kind of idiosyncratic archetypes, and that there's something going on there. So yeah, I think that's another aspect that I would want to bring into a kind of revised notion of what we might be talking about in this Neoplatonic vision. But then I'd want to know how we could make sense of that according to not just the original source material, but also the more recent cognitive science and the way you are framing cognitive science ideas in terms of Neoplatonism and vice versa, right? So because like the one, it's a very easy idea to kind of lose the individuation in entirely, right? And so there's I'm very, that's sort of a preoccupation at the moment, is trying to conceptualize what this sort of like Bonaventure called it the soul's journey into God sort of a thing, but there's this spiritual journey that that does kind of culminate in something, but it's not the culmination in some kind of a abstract totally something stripped of particularity. So anyway, that's just a
no I think this is excellent. I think there's a strand in Neoplatonism that falls prey to the Nietzschean critique, and of course in the late Middle Ages it was the difficulties surrounding the principle of individuation that led to the birth of nominalism, all right? That the idea that no, reality is ultimately these raw individuals, and the categories are actually just mental projections on. So there was a big swing I think, a compensatory swing, to use a Jungian idea. And I do think that I think for that reason that everything you're saying is pertinent. For me, one of the ways I've been trying to think about how to address that is by trying to bring in Zen that emphasizes the suchness of things, right? And the ineffable mystical aspect of the suchness of some, right? Which is that about a thing that cannot be grasped by any of its categories. Exactly what you're talking about, right? And trying to put that into relationship with sort of the Neoplatonic moreness that, well, yeah, but this is part of, it's enriched and it participates in all of this, and trying to understand the relationship between those. So one of the things I'm saying, I agree with you, and I recommend a tradition that is much more oriented towards that the ineffable here nowness, suchness of something, and put that into a deep dialogue with the Neoplatonic.
So yeah, I'm glad we're getting into this, because this is the fertile ground. I'm going to mix metaphors here, but it's also this sort of like hazy veil that I'm trying to break through, because I see something here and I'm trying to kind of making it intelligible. And for me, it gets to this issue. So last time we talked about, it's not about the journey to the pole, it's about the polarity. That
definitely, and I still stand by that. Yeah.
So yeah, I want to kind of swim in that a little bit, because so one of the solutions to this issue that we were just talking about, this problem of kind of particularization versus abstraction and categories and whatnot, is that is through complexification, because when you get integration, you can have differentiation of parts, you can have particularity, but then you get a higher order level of coherence, right? That you kind of get a one out of lower level parts, so that you get sort of a new simplexity, right? There's something that you don't lose the particularity, you gain this sort of greater level oneness out of an integration of a bunch of particularities. And so I find that to be a very kind of happy solution to this, that we can kind of have both of these simultaneously. But then for me, when I think about that, it winds up framing complexification as being sort of the end, goal, if that makes sense. And I think that we'd have to rethink the kind of Platonic soul's ascent if we're doing something like that, because when I read, for example, so Plotinus talks about it's in the fourth Ennead, where he says, sometimes I've been sort of taken out of my body.
Yeah, I was just reading that this morning. Yeah.
Oh, cool. And he describes this kind of mystical thing, right? But he describes what he kind of enters into as being, without parts, totally simple, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things I want to wrap my head around is like, what is that? What's going on there? How do we understand that? Is that explicable through a complexity lens, or is it actually the opposite? Is the one that he is, experiencing in that sense a regression to a kind of simpler kind of mind state in that polarity? I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but I'm
making perfect sense, Brendan.
Okay, yeah.
So here's my attempt to answer that. And yeah, like you said, we're swimming in vague waters, and we have to help each other not drown as much as we can. The buddy system here. For me, the complexification is like the movement of the particle in the field, right? It's how you know the field's there, and the one isn't anything achieved by the complexification. It is that which makes the complexification possible, right? So, like I say, if you'll allow me the analogy, and it'll break at some point, so I get that, but complexification for me is like how the particles are moving in the field, and then you can't, right? You what you then want to stand back and say is, yeah, but what is the field, right, itself? And what Plotinus means by that is, and he's at times very unhelpful, because he uses, maybe he couldn't use anything else, but he uses the two worlds language a lot. But I'm saying we're not committed to that. He's trying to say, yes, but that complexification the principle governing the complexification can't itself be complex, or you'll get into an infinite regress of explanatory principles. Right? That's the argument he's basically making. Like I say, at times, I'm sorry, I'm sounding like I'm better than Plotinus. I'm not. I'm just saying, to our ears, when we're trying to get past, we're post-Nietzschean, we're post-nominalist, and this two-world stuff, rather than in being helpful metaphors, is often distracting, distorting metaphors. We're trying to put it aside, right? That's part of the metamodern project, as I understand it. It's that Plotinus is trying to say the one is that principle. It's if you could put together notions of principle and affordance that makes possible the complexification. And remember, I was arguing last time that complexification is simultaneously up and down, right? You don't just, right? I won't repeat those arguments. But the idea is, well, the one is what binds all of that together, so the process never loses a through line of intelligibility.
So, well, to help maybe ground this in kind of actual like praxis, because one of the things that was compelling to me were some of these kind of cross-cultural and cross-contemplative studies that tried to look at, okay, well, is Plotinus doing the same thing that, Buddhist monks are doing, essentially, right? And I guess I would just throw that out as a question just to kind of get some bearings a little bit. When he describes his experience, do you think that sort of experience, I shouldn't even say the sort, do you think that the experience he's describing is more or less the same experience that people in other contemplative or meditative traditions experience, or is it a different thing? If that
so this is the long-standing battle between the perennialists and the constructivists. I
also don't want to take us too far afield. I
want to wrestle with this. I think this is right. What I want to try to argue towards is the idea that you can have a unifying principle, like the principle of evolution, but that doesn't mean that it produces homogeneous results, because the principle is constitutively actualized in relationship to variable environments that are going to produce different organisms. And I want to say something like, there's something universal that is acting sort of analogous to a law in a scientific law sense, which is, and I think it has something to do with, I mentioned to you last time, where you can get to this place where you're trying to relate to being and not to beings, not even the property that beings share in common, but to being, like the thing that Heidegger pounds over our head again and again and again, right? Where you realize that the relevance realization process is itself irrelevant. You get to sort of transight rather than an insight. And I think there's cognitive processes and the depth of being that is disclosed, right? Correspondingly, I don't want to say correspondingly because people think of the correspondence theory of truth, and that's not what I mean. Resonantly, okay? That's a better word. So there are sort of universal cognitive processes, universal dimensions or levels that are disclosed. However, how that is taken up, how that realization is taken up such that it is transformatively relevant to the people who are undergoing it is by its very nature going to complexify to fit the complexity, historical and environmental, of the context that people are in. That's how and I think the fact that we can't resolve the perennialism, constructivism debate, because we can't, and we keep trying to, and we can't. I propose, this is like Hicks meta argument. Hicks argues that we haven't been able to resolve any of these spiritual questions. So the meta argument is we should regard the universe as fundamentally spiritually ambiguous. And then that means we should understand our spirituality in relationship to that. I'm proposing something very similar. I'm saying that I think the attempt to resolve that question is misframing it in a fundamental way. So, because I gave you, I think a non-controversial example. You have a universal principle, evolution, but that doesn't mean that it produces the same things. In fact, the nature of the principle tells you it's going to do exactly the opposite. It's going to, and no pun intended, it's going to proliferate. All right, it's in its creativity.
So, I mean, let me know if I'm on the right track with this from what you're saying. Let's say, like, you have a principle of differentiation. The principle itself is unitive, but what is the content, if we want to talk about that way, is, and so simultaneously you can kind of have unity and diversity, something like that. You're able to experience the principle of plurality. And is it something like that? Because it would seem to kind of, Jung came up, and it seems like we're moving in that kind of conjunction of opposites, that like, if you could experience maximal unity of principled differentiation, then somehow that might be probably a mystical sort of
I think that's right. And think about, I mean, again, as an analogy, think about the singularity of the Big Bang. All right, it's an absolute singularity. Yet it's a singularity that somehow contains within itself all of the principles of differentiation and all the laws that are going to fold out from that. And then even as it unfolds, the unity underlies things in issues of, not issues, in, facts around entanglement and relativity and all kinds of things like that. Saying there's right. And so I'm trying to give a couple of examples, one from physics and one from biology. Is like, actually, when you're pushing on the limits, what you get to is exactly what you're talking about. And I think this is what D.C. Schindler was trying to argue when he says, look, in Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, if the absolute doesn't include the relative, it's not actually the absolute. So, the principle, right? I would put it a little bit different. I would say the principle of both what we call unity and differentiation are in the one, and then they both unfold from it and within it always.
So how do you conceive of the contemplative or meditative process or practice, in the sense of, because my interpretation of Plotinus is that he's saying, through contemplation, I have these experiences that he describes, right? So then the question for my mind, and then this kind of brings in this cognitive science bit, I suppose, it's like, well, what is the mind doing in those circumstances that it is somehow being absorbed into the one? Like, how do we understand these practices as relating to this reality?
I think that's an excellent question. I've been trying to answer that, especially in the mindfulness work I've been doing. The article I published recently in Rick Rapetti's anthology on the philosophy of meditation, the thing I published on in hypnosis and meditation on reformulating the mindfulness construct. I have another paper in submission for another anthology that Brian Ostafin is organizing around this. And what I've been trying to argue is that you have two movements. There's a meditative movement of mindfulness, what I call scaling down, in which you're breaking gestalts and you're moving towards features and you're doing transparency, opacity. You're trying to get down to raw suchness, right? And then there are contemplative practices when you're trying to gestalt out and get towards sort of this resonant at one mint. And again, the point isn't the poles, and the literature bears me out on this, by the way. I think the point is to get better at traversing within the polarity, powered by the polarity.
So you make a distinction then, and actually like a very profound one, between meditation and contemplation.
Yes.
Okay, because these are often conflated, as I was just doing myself. Yeah, because they're actually essentially the pursuance of both poles, which is very fascinating then, because it would seem that what Plotinus is doing or describing is contemplation.
Yes,
which would be a very different sense. So if we would, when he talks about theoria, is that his word essentially?
Theoria is very much a contemplative practice, very much. Now, interesting, there were probably if you think about two moments of insight, and I think there's a continuum between insight and what we're talking about, I should say. there's one moment where you have to break an inappropriate frame, and meditative practices are great for doing that and trying to get you back as much as you can, open up to the new information, the suchness, right? But there's also practices that go the other way. There's practices that make frame, open you up, try to get you making greater gestalts that can incorporate this newness into a more encompassing and richer model, right? And that's what happens in an insight, and it self-organizes. Now, what I want to propose to you is notice how those two can interpenetrate in a moment of insight.
Yeah.
Imagine if you did these practices and you get something at a bigger scale that was like an insight in which the two become completely interpenetrating. I think that's what prajna is. I think that's what prajna is.
And this sounds very much then I'm getting a complexification picture from this. If you focus on the suchness of things, then you're basically zooming in on the particularity. You could almost say the differentiation. Every single moment is different. The suchness of things is by, if you were to really emphasize it, it is like nothing else. No thing is like anything else because you have no category for which to subsume it in. So it is just total differentiation. But if that's what the meditative practices are doing, then by contrast, the contemplative practices are trying to find the broadest levels of sort of categorization. Now, if you're able to do both of these things, then what you're somehow doing is categorizing the maximal amount of differentiation, which would be you're integrating the ultimate amount of differentiation, which is what complexification is all about. I don't know. Is that
and I mean, and you get Blake's famous "to see a world in a grain of sand," right? And there's equivalents in the Buddhist tradition where you see all of the cosmos in a barley grain, right, and vice versa. And it's Spinoza's Scientia Intuitiva. You see each premise in the entire argument, and you see the entire argument in each premise, right, simultaneously. Now, here's the thing, though. At a functional descriptive level, functional explanational level, this is a kind of complexification. But here's what I want to propose to you. If that complexification enters into this kind of poetic conformity with the complexity of reality, you actually get a realization of a kind of absolute oneness. Because
so unpack that a little bit.
Well, I mean, so I'm going to play with a metaphor here, right? So when I grasp this, my hand, this and this become one, right? So although this is a complex thing, and it's highly differentiated and highly integrated, and that allows me to grasp the bottle, but that complexity affording me conformity actually makes me at one with the bottle. And I'm saying that's exactly how you're optimally gripping reality in a particular way. And so, although so I'm trying to say that both things are right at the level of how you're describing what's going on. There's this complexification, but when the complexification sort of is in parallel, conforming to the dynamics of the intelligibility of reality, then you get a radical at one-ment.
Okay, and then so this is really because now it sort of sets itself up in my mind in terms of relating this back to meaning, because for many different reasons. But again, we were talking about earlier, if we're thinking about processing information for viability, there's something about this is where the conformity aspect I think makes a lot of sense because it's viability enhancing to have an optimal grip on reality, let's say, right? So if you are able to produce greater clarity in a more accurate world model and be in greater actual oneness with reality, then that will be perceived as a sense of this is a deeply meaningful, salient, important kind of experience. So there's that going on there, which also I think in some ways helps to bridge back to a question that kind of came up in our last conversation about, the very notion of absolute meaning. Is that a nonsensical point because it depends on some kind of a transjective contextual relationship to establish. But this would seem to approximate that in some way. Of course, it's defined by the context of an individual having the experience. So it's that transjective context. But if the experience being had is with as much of reality as is sort of possible, let's say, for that organism to meaningfully relate to, then that would sort of be the maximally meaningful experience for that entity to have, if that makes sense.
I think that's right. But I guess I want to try and draw it out a little bit farther. because we talked about and I've mentioned it earlier, the possibility. I want to put two things together. Remember, I said you can concentrate on how sort of the complexification is disclosing the ligaments of the polarity of the field, or you can just get the oneness of the field. So imagine you've got this complexification coupled to complexification. And but then what you do is you stand back. I don't know what that means, but you move to deeper prajna, in which, but I want to get the principle behind, and the principle that's being disclosed, and then you realize it's just one principle. And that's what I mean when you move to this place where the relevance realization, the complexification of cognition, the optimal gripping get you to this place. And then what you do is, after you've optimally gripped, you now can open your hand, if you'll allow me, in a way you couldn't before. And so you can move to, the grammar to grammar. That's a metaphor I use. Like we're complexifying our intelligibility with all the speech, but underneath it is some unifying grammar. And then presumably there's some unifying grammar of the world. And then I can shift to that, and I drop away the complexification of relevance realization, and I just get that field to field, principle to principle, grammar to grammar thing happening.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, so there's a lot there that we'd have to unpack. But I'm wondering, I mean, for me, that's still going to be situated in an individual mind. It's going to be an experience going on. So it's going to have a certain structure to it, and it's going to be based on the complex organization of that human mind to have. So it doesn't, there's an apprehension or a sense of absoluteness to that, but it's still one deeply contextualized according to that particular.
Well, you only, and this is where Proclus is good. And this is a correction I think he made to Plotinus that's a valuable one. He said, and this, you'll like this because this has Jungian, I think it may even influenced Jung. He said, you actually only come into a mystical relationship with the one in you. Like there's how the one is in you. Now, that's not a nothing, because that's the deepest way you can participate in the one. But right, it's still the one in you. Which he doesn't mean your ego or anything like that. But the difficulty I have with Jung is he tends to make that at least early to middle Jung. I hold open space for later Jung. I want that heard, but right, he makes it an intrapsychic event, where for Proclus it's not. It's properly right an ontological event, not just an intrapsychic event.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, then you have to bring in questions of, idealism into this, I suppose, because like the ultimate, how do I put this? If there is going to be a total correspondence, you'd have to remove any kind of separation. So ultimate reality would somehow have to exist as a possibility within what we would think of as a minded experience. But then you kind of flip the script, and it's like, no, the mind is the totality. So there's nothing. I'm not sure if I'm.
Yeah, I don't think. First of all, I think you're right. Many people make that move. I don't see anything gained by moving from realism to idealism. I don't think there's any explanatory. These sort of arguments that you would use to get there via Kant are arguments that I would first use to undermine Kant in a profound way. And there are. I mean, we've had them from Fichte on, right? Kant says, well, you know what? You can't use cause, which is a relationship within phenomenal experience, to talk about what it caused all of phenomenal experience. So you can't do metaphysics. You can't make arguments and infer God, because you can't. That's to extend the causal relationship beyond its proper domain. And then he says, well, the thing in itself is nothing you can ever experience, but it causes your experience. And it's like, you're doing exactly what the thing in itself, what you said you couldn't do about God, right? And you get all these problems. I want to say we get to this place by really taking seriously at the very beginning transjectivity and intelligibility. And so I think idealism is to then undermine that very.
I agree.
That very claim.
No, I very much agree, and I've also found it has certain seductive qualities to it because it sort of answers certain problems, but I find that the problems it creates to ultimately kind of be more problematic. But that aside, what I do want to try to dig into a little bit more here, though, is given that then, and by that I mean this transjective frame, and I am still curious about what we might be able to salvage from this notion of an absolute or something. And just to kind of like set this up a little bit, right? I mean, there's been this deep connection between Neoplatonism and the Platonic tradition more broadly with Christianity, and of course in this context the one gets kind of syncretized with God, and then there's the sense of you can think about the one in terms of the deity basically, and so you get this, I think, a very interesting Christianized Platonism that comes from that, which again comes up in Dante in a just very sublime, gorgeous way. And so that remains deeply attractive to me in a way of trying to see how it's possible, if it is, to explore what we're talking about within some kind of an other, let's say, right? If this God represents some kind of this I don't know, other, a kind of ultimate other that we relate to or something, how do we correlate some of that, mapping to the mapping that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, I think Dante is a good place to start, and the idea of agape, right? And what agape does is it turns around the arrow of relevance realization, where the fundamental question, and we are the beings whose beings in question. So, I mean, the question of our being at that level is not how things are relevant to me, it's how am I relevant to reality. Right. And that's, and what you learn I would argue, and I think many people would nod yes, is Dante is showing all the people that got that the wrong way around. Right. All the hell is filled with all people who tried to keep the arrow this way, and they were never, therefore, they never found agape. They could never love wisely. And I think sin is the failure to love wisely. So what I would say is, right, it's the other, but the otherness isn't like another thing. This is the problem when we talk about other. It's other than being another thing. And so what a lot of the tradition, I think, recommends is think about, instead of it being another thing, think about it being that which turns the arrow of relevance around so that agape becomes possible for you, and so that you can know reality agapically rather than just consumatively or even just erotically. And so for me, the absolute is that which, right, that which can it's the inexhaustible source of intelligibility that can pull on me so powerfully that it can turn that arrow around. That's how I think of the absolute, right? And if I try to then say, oh, but this is how, like, if I try to then fold the absolute back into my egocentric framework, then I actually lose. And you can hear some Levinas in what I'm doing, of course, right? And right, and for me, this is like, to say that my beloved partner is other to me could sound like she is an alien to me, and we're foreign, but it's not that. It's that she can turn that arrow around in me in a powerful way. That's how I would recommend trying to think about that.
Yeah. I mean, so, in the final canto of the Paradiso, Dante sees the beatific vision, and at the kind of core of it, right, it's like these shapes that kind of resolve themselves, like a trinity of shapes that resolves himself into a human face, which is like the Christ face. And then he kind of goes through that, and then it's like, it sort of ends, there's more to the story but it's ineffable. It can't be explained. But I think that recognition of the face, if that makes sense, like at the ultimate kind of teleological end or whatever, is a meaningful thing that I also think is deeply ingrained in our whole human spiritual proclivity to see something in the cosmos that is the other as also familiar, to see like a intentionality, to see this sort of something deeply that I can relate to. And so I'm wondering if that face could be kind of metaphorically understood as the intelligibility that we ourselves find with with reality itself.
And notice how we have this verb to face and facing, right? And facing reality, which is this, and Spinoza, and this is not properly I haven't seen enough. I think Claire Carlisle talks about it, but it hasn't been talked about enough. Spinoza, everybody knows about the attributes in Spinoza. There's mind and there's space, right, and all the extension, and there's all this stuff, and the modes and the conatus and all that. But and and the three kinds of knowing and scientia intuitiva, and all that's important. I'm not trying to dismiss it. You have to really wrestle with it. But Spinoza also has this phrase that he uses periodically, which he calls the face of the universe, which is this really interesting, and it plays this role that you're like, he doesn't ever try to like sort of explicate it or prove it or anything like that. He just invokes it, right? And I think there's something right about that. I think Alicia Uraro, and we talked about this last time, that narrative can get our mind in the right sort of processing mode for tracking the way reality is unfolding, and it's true that way, not true because its propositions are accurate, right? It's a modal truth rather than a propositional content truth, right? And I think the same way about this facing function that you're talking about. There's something about getting into the I thou that discloses reality to us. I think because the I thou properly turns this arrow around. I think that's what the I thou relationship. I think the I it is the arrow going this way, and the I thou is the arrow going that way. And the I thou relationship, like that relationship where we're interfacing with somebody, that facing function, and Levinas picks up on it too, as well as Buber. It's like, yeah, there's something about doing that. It has all kinds of dangers, anthropomorphism, etc., projection, all that. But there's something about doing that gets us into a mode of functioning that discloses reality in, like, it ushers us into the depths, into a kind of ontological depth perception, depth participation that is otherwise inaccessible. And for me, this is where the non-theism and the theism sort of are on a horizon, right? I'm the non-theist who thinks, like Hick and others, there can be many faces, and there can be things other than faces. I think there's other things we do that do that for us too. But the theist, of course, and Dante is a theist, says there's ultimately the best possible face. That's the face of Christ. And it's interesting because, of course, one of the things he has to do is he has to give up. He has to reprioritize. Beatrice can't be the ultimate face for him, even though she's beautiful and she's transcendent and all of that. He has to love wisely. He has to love. His ultimate love has to be for what is ultimate.
Gosh, yeah. Oh man, so, there's a lot here. I mean, so I'm not sure if you've explored this one at all. God Without Being by Jean-Luc Marion.
Yeah, I read quite a bit about it, and then I've been reading D.C. Schindler's critique of and even more Hickstock's critique, her critique in Aspects of Truth of Jean-Luc Marion and his Neoplatonism. He's deeply influenced by Dionysius. And
You're right.
She has a very profound criticism of him.
Interesting. I'd be curious to know what that is. But one thing that I really took away from that work was the whole iconography, or iconology, I guess you could say. And the differentiation between idols and icons and all that. It's a very, very helpful thing for me. But thinking about that, the way that the face can be something that draws you beyond itself, that it's sort of this abyss of increasing meaning.
But see what the face does, right? The face is the suchness of a person that portends the moreness of the person, right? Which is like it's Wittgenstein said, like he said, what is it we imagine when we imagine someone's soul other than to imagine their face, right? And yet, but of course, a face isn't a soul, right?
Well, I was just gonna say, for me, and I think you can even, there's something about eyes in particular that are there's a reason why symbolically they keep showing up, because I think there's something about not just faces, but the eyes being the windows of the soul, but that part of the face that sort of is what draws you into the moreness, even especially, and of course the whether it's the these Masonic images of eyes, or the Eye of Horus. It's always been a very profound image, I think, for that representation of that iconographic thing that pulls you in. There's a depthness to it because you're seeing into this surface that itself kind of pretends something much, much deeper.
Yeah. And Plato has, I mean, in Socrates, the eye shows up in an interesting way because it shows up dialogically. Because Plato emphasizes he's playing with what's happening in dialectic, Platonic dialectic, but you see yourself like literally in the reflection in the other people's eyes, but you also see them through how they're seeing you. And he does this wonderful thing about how the eye is exactly that place in which you not only get access to the other person's soul, but you can reflectively get access into your own soul, and the two start to call each other in a powerful way.
Well, and again, I've been really blown away. I think I first got this from Greg Enriquez's work, but I've been finding it in lots of other places as well. Just the whole notion that self-consciousness is dependent upon other relationships, that, that language we are connecting with other minds. So it's only through the other that we can understand ourselves. But I think what we're getting at, this whole topic, this is really good. This is, it relates to me for, I think somehow when I use a word like God, or what I think a word like God can mean in a very meaningful way that is not just equivocation, but can really tie together various layers of a spiritual kind of tradition, is that there's something that we recognize in the universe that is like ourselves. We find ourselves in the universe. We find something intelligible there. And if you want to use the image of the face or what have you, I feel like that is in particular what differentiates the kind of secular materialistic reductionism of modernity from a more spiritual or religious orientation towards reality. Because I was thinking for a long time, like, what, science gives us such you could say an improved model of reality compared to, say, ancient maps of reality, but it also seemed to lose something profound. And it was like, what is it that we don't find there that we found in this other place? And for me, it was, we don't find ourselves there. We don't look at the world and see ourselves. Now we have to be careful about that, because as you said, that can be, and I think most of the time often was, anthropomorphization, projection, and sort of this animistic kind of blending of inner and outer worlds that we kind of put ourselves on reality. But what I'm deeply interested in from a metamodern spiritual perspective is to see what legitimately exists in the world, in the cosmos, that is self-like, that we can relate to. And so this is, I'd like to kind of, there's a lot of fertile ways that I think this topic could be explored. But one of the things I want to ask you too, though, is the Buddha, from what I understand, would sort of he wouldn't brook metaphysical conversations about cosmology and stuff. He'd be like, no, it's a waste of time, right? But I think, especially if we're talking in the context of kind of Christian Neoplatonism and this sort of syncretism between, the ultimate one and God, there is in the theistic traditions the sense of God the creator, that God is the one who set it all up, right? So there's that element, which even in Plato, in the Timaeus, there's a demiurge, and so there's a similar kind of stuff. There's similar stuff to be drawn there. But so I would pitch that to you. I mean, do you take a more Buddhist stance and be like, no, we just don't know where all this comes from, or is there something meaningful to be said about looking at this incredibly complexifying universe and all sorts of let's just say the complexity of the universe, and potentially this ability to see something self-like in it, and then maybe even to impute to that other the role of the self that set it up, so to speak. Does any of that what would you do with any of that?
That's good. So first of all, I'd want to make a distinction between horizontal and vertical causation. You can ask what's the cause of it, and you can mean what was the first event, or you could mean what's the cause of it, what's the governing principle at work right now. I think science can really do the first question quite well, because science is about tracking the relationship, the lawful relationships, the intelligible relationship between events, defining processes, finding forces, all that stuff. So the horizontal question, I think, is largely being answered. And of course, you're getting into problems with, trying to get something as the cause of the Big Bang, and you're running into these pseudo-Kantian problems of, wait, how can there be anything before the singularity? That doesn't. And so I acknowledge that, but if the question is where did we come from, I think for me science answers that question very well. So I don't think of a grand artificer building the universe the way a human being builds a chair or something like that. Now, there's a notion of creation in Erigena that's very different, which is creation is this process by which God flows out, right? And then flows back. It's the creation is actually the polarity within which everything is found. And so it's vertical. And then these are the kinds of questions science can't answer, because science actually presupposes this dimension. It presupposes intelligibility. Like when we're getting into this, what we call the ontological. And then if we're asking the question, what's behind it all? Notice I changed the sentence, right? Then I think the question is not one that can be answered just scientifically, because it's a question that probes into things that science presupposes. And for me, we now come to the possibility that there are truths that are disclosable to us only when we undergo significant transformation. I'm just going to invoke a lot of arguments, points that I for which individually I have extended arguments. That there are truths that are only disclosed to us in transformation, that a lot of that transformation can only be afforded through imaginal engagement with reality, and through aspirational and agapic engagement. And when you put those together, you have very often what I would call religious symbolism, like the face. Now, the tricky thing we have to get to is we have to distinguish between something that is epistemically indispensable for us to afford the transformation, to properly refract the disclosure so it's accessible to us. And the imaginal goes both ways, right? The ritual goes both ways. And it binds the future self and the current self aspirationally, all that stuff, right? I think you can make a very strong case for that being indispensable to us. Whether or not that makes it metaphysically necessary is a different thing. For example, I would propose to you that it is conceivable that there could be other intelligent beings who would have to have completely other kinds of imaginal things, and the face for them would make no sense, like an octopus. Like imagine a super intelligent octopus, a face. Well, why a face? More of my brain is in my arms than in my face, right? And so it wouldn't be indispensable to them to have the face, all right? And it would be something else. So again, we have to make a distinction between a function that I think is metaphysically necessary, and then a particular way in which that function works for us, given our kind of embodiment, etc.
Sure. Yeah. And so I guess to dig into that slightly would be, I mean, let's say when you talk about the Big Bang, and we talk about what the narrative that science gives us, I mean, I also totally agree. I mean, this should be where we're looking for our answers of where do we come from. But it also then sets up these questions, and you hinted that there may be Kantian questions, but they do seem to be serious questions in terms of not just like, well, what caused the Big Bang, but also we seem to live in a world that has, say, specific physical constants, right? And you get into things like the anthropic principle that seem to be like, where do these come from, right? And so in the realm of thinking, as we were, of whatever this intelligible, familiar sense is that we can identify in reality itself, and the hypothesis that could be proposed of, well, whatever that is, which would be much bigger than us, might somehow have an intelligence that is like ours, that we could somehow situate as being the kind of constraint conditions that set up such a universe as ours. I mean, that would be one approach. of course, you could also say, well, we live in a universe that has basically evolving universes, and every black hole creates a universe and it has its own constants, etc. But then you get this infinite regress where you would, well, what created the conditions in which you have an evolving universe of evolving universes, etc. I'm kind of agnostic on this question. I don't know, but I find it to be a very compelling one. And I think that the degree to which, one engages the kind of Neoplatonic framework that we're thinking of in a theistic way, I think that there's something that might be something to that issue of sort of origins
okay. Well, let's try, because I want to push back a bit.
Sure.
Because, like I said, I want to distinguish the question, where do we come from, from the question, what's behind it all, which
okay,
right, and so. Like I said, I think the first one science handles well. Second one, science is not set up to handle.
Well, I could also, maybe I could clarify that slightly instead of, because the question for me isn't where do we come from, or you'd have to clarify, because it's not just where do we come from. I think we have the story of evolution. So, it's sort of like, what's the scale that we're talking about? Who's we, right? So when I'm asking the question, it's not where do people come from. I think we get that through evolution. Where does the earth come from? We get that through, these broad cosmic evolutionary stories. But then it's more like, where does everything come from? Which I think really is the question maybe that you're framing as what's behind it all, which
yeah, because if you frame the second question as, where did it come from, you get the infinite regress problem. Like this is, Heidegger keeps making this point, when you're trying to say, why is there something rather than nothing, and you think, well, what I'm looking for is the first cause, then you get to the first cause, and it is either caused or uncaused, and then you're back to, oh, but why is that, rather, and you can't give a causal answer to it. So like you have to sort of drop, like like you have to drop conflating these two, and you have to say, okay, I'm not asking that question, I'm trying to ask, like, what is the ground of being, and for that, like I say, I think the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition and the Christian Neoplatonic tradition really wrestles with this. But Plotinus is very clear that the one is not any kind of thinking agent, right? It's not, it's not intelligent. It is the source of, it is the parental ancestor of intelligence and intelligibility, such that they fit together. And so it is not itself intelligible or intelligent, because you would then lose its capacity to explain why intelligence and intelligibility are, how they both are governed, and governed such that they fit together and belong together. And so for me, that's, and I think this is a great argument. And what's interesting is, it's such a great argument that the Christian tradition basically has to acknowledge it, and then tries its best to get around it in these various ways.
Well, that's a question for you. I mean, I'll frame it in this language, and you'll probably want to say, well, I don't want to turn it that way. But do you think that the way the Neoplatonic tradition gets Christianized deforms it in some profound way that kind of causes it to be, it loses more than it gains in that syncretism?
That's a really hard question, and I'm not trying to dodge it. And it's a really good question. I think that, and you can look, and you look for something that's convergent and other, like what the Sufi tradition, that's also taking the Neoplatonic and trying to wrap it into a different theistic thing. And they, of course, don't have recourse to the Trinity, or nor do they think they should make use of that as a way of trying to deal with this issue, which says to me that I don't think the Trinity is, it may be indispensable, but it may not be metaphysically necessary, to bring out the distinction. I think creating the imaginal icons such that we can face reality, and facing reality is the definition of maturity. So we can, in order to be spiritually mature, we need the imaginal face that both calls us beyond and turns the arrow around, but also refracts the depths of reality. I think this is indispensable. And I think when Christianity did that, and Islam, and when Islam does what it does to try and make that work, I think that, and the Neoplatonists have this. They have this in all of the theurgic practices, right? And so I think those ritual those ritual facings, I'll try and play with that word, are indispensable. And therefore and the degree to which they genuinely help people cultivate wisdom and meaning, they are to be commended. The problem with them, and this is my refrain, that which makes us adaptive makes us simultaneously prone to self-deception. They also come with the real ongoing danger of projection and anthropomorphism. And I think when you make your particular imaginal facing a metaphysical necessity, which I think has been a strong strain, not the only strain, a strong strain within Christianity, for example, but there's similar things going on in Islam, then you tip the balance in favor of the anthropomorphism and the projection. Now, of course, there always will be the mystics who will try to recall people back, right? To say, no, it's an icon, look through it. It's not an idol that you should look at. And Jean-Luc Marion is even trying to do that right now, I think. Sure. But that's my take on it. So this is why this distinction that I keep making between indispensability and necessity, metaphysical necessity, there's something that is, epistemically indispensable to us because of our embodied, embedded, etc. nature, but that doesn't mean it's metaphysically necessary. I use the analogy that English is indispensable for me because of the way I'm embedded, I'm culturally, right? And it has to be something like a natural language because I'm this kind of primate that evolved this way. But I don't think that means that cognitive agency depends on English. That would be, well, clearly it's false even on this planet. And, and it might be that, if there are aliens, they use something very radically different than language. And so nothing even remotely analogous to English might exist. So that's what I try to, I think, right. I think the Christian Neoplatonism does something indispensable, but it errs when it thinks it's making a metaphysical claim. And the way that metaphysical claim shows up, and then I'll shut up so you can reply, is with exclusivity claims. The exclusivity claims are the claims that seem to belie, to seem to bespeak that, oh, no. This isn't just indispensable. This is the only way. This is the metaphysically necessary.
Yeah. Well, who was I think it was a pre-Socratic philosopher, right? Who said that if horses had gods, they'd look like horses. And we were talking about the octopus earlier. If the octopus put a quote unquote face to the universe, it would look like an octopus. I mean, for me, I'm very compelled by this aspiration to want to find something beyond an impersonal universe, but it doesn't have to be a personal universe either. It could be a transpersonal universe. And what I find attractive about the mystics is that there seems to be a sense of you can do the personal universe thing, but there is then that God beyond that God, and that's where that maybe. I mean, even in Dante himself, right? He sees the face, but then he's drawn beyond it, and then it becomes totally ineffable.
He doesn't speak. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So that to me speaks to me, and there's something I know that for some people that would be a defacing of ultimate reality to take away the face of it, as it were. But there's a kind of a pre-trans distinction there. Yeah.
But don't we worry about the person who is only in love with the pretty face, actually doesn't realize that they need to see through it, meaning both by means of it and beyond it, to the soul behind it? I mean, you don't want a relationship with a magazine smile, right? Right. And so, there's a big difference between defacing and interfacing, right? And so, I'm sorry, Brendan, but we're going to have to draw it to a close. The time flew by, and this has been fantastic. So this will be part 2. I think we'll have at least another one back on Brendan's channel. I'd like to give my guests the parting word.
Well, thank you so much. I totally echo that. This was a blast. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to continuing the conversation. But thank you so much. Deeply appreciate it.
Thank you so much.